African Liberty webinar. It's so fascinating to have three amazing individuals join us for this month's discussion, which is around quite interesting and very important topic to Africa's future. It concerns the continent's rising debt, even though we shouldn't be really talking about the continent as a whole, but individual countries are having crazily staggering external debt as well. But it doesn't hurt to say the continent generally is experiencing the same problem on a broader scale. So to Dr. Dhlwayo, may I request you kindly introduce yourself in like 2 sentences, since you already filled it for Dr. Dushala.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dhlwayo. I'm an economist, and I work for UNDP in South Africa as a senior economist. I've worked in quite a number of countries, from Zimbabwe, Mozambique, Botswana, Tanzania, and Kenya. So, I've been in this, so now I'm back again to Southern Africa. Over.
Brilliant. Thanks for that introduction. So, Amara Ekeruche is a development economist and a writer. She is a senior research fellow at the Center for the Study of Economics of Africa. Uma's interests, research, and policy focus cuts across development economics, public finance, and debt management, macroeconomic and fiscal management, and she served as an IMF Youth Fellow. Welcome, Uma. And our other guest is the Dr. Magalie Masamba, and she is, and I hope that's the right pronoun. Magalie is a senior fellow of the African Sovereign Debt Justice Network, and has a recent publication, which I'm going to drop the link in the chat box. There is a publication on debt management, and I think the actual title of that publication is an edited volume. That volume is COVID-19 and Sovereign Debt, the Case of SADC. For anyone interested, I will drop the link once I'm done reading the bios. But yeah, Dr. Masamba is currently a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Human Rights, University of Pretoria. And should I say that edited volume was actually published by Pretoria University Law Press. And she's also at the Global Development Policy Center at Boston University. Our research centers on sovereign debt and its impact on development. So as you can see, we have very competent individuals to help us digest this topic. But my first question, and as I guess the first question from anyone joining should be, or perhaps will be, that why do we owe this much? I was listening to a South African channel that's reported that the Financial Times just 2 days ago wrote an article that South African government should, thanks Anna for dropping that link, that South African government should raise commodity prices so that the country can have enough money to pay for its foreign debts. And generally, not only South Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa owes over $700 billion in public external debt. And that was the 2021 estimate by United Nations. And of course, that debt to the GDP ratio on the continent is about 350 billion. So the question is, why do we owe this much? I don't know who want to go first, but I'd like to get everyone's perspective on this. You want to go first to my far left, Dr. Masamba?
Sure, thank you so much. I think that's such a great question. And it's definitely a question that I have received, especially as somebody who's working in the field of sovereign debt. If I could answer that briefly, I think for me, the starting point of the discussion is really that countries do need to finance their development, and debt in itself is not bad. The question, or at least debt becomes a problem when it's unsustainable or mismanaged. So going back to your question, why is it that many countries have unsustainable debt burdens, especially when we have had quite a number of multilateral and even bilateral debt relief initiatives in the past. Just a few that happened in the past, the Heavily Indebted Poor Country Program that was trying to give countries a clean slate. But surprisingly, after a lot of these programs, you know, HIPIC, the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, and so forth, you'd find that a decade later, many African countries again had very very high debt levels for various reasons. So one of the reasons that I can contribute to this question is the fact that you'd find that in the mid-2010s, countries began to look for new sources of finance. And one of the interesting sources of finance was really private capital markets. So during this time, you'd find that African countries had a boom when it comes to foreign currency bonds, Euro bonds. You would also find that as time went on, new bilateral players, such as China, for example, which is our biggest bilateral creditor, became new players, you know, on the market. Now, why did countries find that the capital markets were more attractive? I think one of the reasons was that, as opposed to borrowing from multilateral institutions like the World Bank, the capital markets offered finance that didn't have conditionality. So that made it much more attractive, but has led to quite a number of problems. If I can jump to more recent times, we're in, I don't know if, I can't say post-COVID because we're still in the middle of it, but you'd find that a lot of countries have borrowed out of necessity. And many of the countries that are very vulnerable, that, you know, were the HIPIC countries and other resource-rich countries, have again reached very concerning debt levels. So I think that's what I can say for now.
Right, and that's really spot on. So I want to get what Amara want to add, particularly also answering the question as to why do we need, you know, to borrow to sustain our economies, but more so about why are these borrowings so necessary generally?
Thank you for the very great question. So the reason why the continent is very much reliant on debts is a structural one. We're just not earning enough revenue to self-finance our development priorities, right? So tax revenue as a share of GDP is 16% in Africa, whereas for OECD countries, it's up to 23%, for some countries, 26%. So we're not exporting enough, we're not generating enough revenues. And so we have to lean towards external sources of finance, whether it's multilateral creditors, the World Bank, IMF, AFDB, or bilateral creditors like China, as was mentioned earlier, or, you know, private creditors now. In the last decade, we've seen a surge of Eurobonds. So we're now more reliant on debt service, on you know, debts to finance our development priorities. And it's only getting worse, particularly as the COVID-19 pandemic is, you know, we're feeling its effects. We're seeing a lot of cash transfer programs come into play. Governments are trying to, you know, to a large extent, ameliorate the effects of the pandemic on vulnerable households. We're also seeing, you know, transfers going to businesses, to the hospitality sector, to the health sector, tourism sector, sectors that have really been impacted by the pandemic, you know. And so there's a rise in fiscal deficits, spending is increasing, revenue is declining. And so we are all the more, you know, leaning towards debts to finance our development priorities.
Right. I guess the question for Mr. Rojas will be, as you hear Amara said, we have this need apparent in Africa. And since you are with the UNDP, you understand that the development deficit, particularly the infrastructure deficit on the continent, is humongous. And somehow we need some money to finance this development deficit, this infrastructure deficit. So what do you think, Mr. Rojas, should be the right approach to solving this infrastructure deficit without necessarily making ourselves, creating for ourselves this burden of a debt? your microphone is muted.
Thank you, moderator. Just to echo my colleagues, I think most of the points they raised, I actually agree with them. But I think there is also some underlying problem which most of our African countries have. Because if you look at even the debt which we have borrowed and how it has been invested, most of it has not been in productive sectors. So really, this is the issue, like how do we use these resources which we borrow externally or even domestically? And also sometimes even when our countries are blessed, I come from Zimbabwe, and sometime, I think about some few years ago, the country discovered that it had diamonds. But these diamonds, up to now, we don't know the revenue, the revenue which was generated from those diamonds, what it was used for. So it's also how we manage our resources, which is, to me, quite crucial even going forward. Because of course we can talk of COVID, that COVID, has actually made, our debt problem worse. But even before COVID, Africa's debt has been increasing. In fact, since 2008, African debt had reached about 46% of GDP. And then when COVID only worsened the problem. And we know the challenges there also for instance, I worked in Mozambique. And when I worked in Mozambique in the early 2000s, the country had just, reached, hippie completion point. Its debt had actually been forgiven. And really the donors were funding their budget to actually make sure they make the investments in the social sector and even infrastructure. And I wrote a paper that time that, look, if we are not careful, Mozambique will come back, will actually be a debt-distressed country. And I think the story of Mozambique. In 2016, there was this issue of hidden debt, where some, public company borrowed money, and this money, the government was not aware of it. So it ended up being a contingent liability on the government. And as we are speaking, Mozambique is one of the debt-distressed countries. So you can see that even when we get debt relief, we really don't learn any lessons from that. So I think, to me, the issue is how do we manage our resources, even the little revenue we generate, even the aid we get from our donors. Are we channeling those resources into sectors which really, will generate growth so that we are able to pay back the debt? How do we even manage that debt, to me, is quite important, because in most cases, we don't know how much our country owes. And the challenge now is we have got a different type of different composition of debt, as colleagues have talked, my fellow colleague Palenese have said. There's China, and there's also private, private lenders. And really now, to talk of even debt restructuring is really a challenge, because you are dealing with a multiplicity of lenders, unlike before, where you'll be dealing with multilateral banks and the Paris Club. And I think this is really the challenge. How do we make sure there is, coordination among lenders and donors to really address this debt challenge because of this multiplicity of donors? I know, for instance, the common framework is trying to address that, but even countries, the 3 countries which have applied for that, Zambia, Chad, and Ethiopia, is still, nothing has moved. In fact, I was reading today that even the negotiation for Zambia, they anticipate that they will start in April. So these are some of the issues which we really need to grapple with when we talk of debt. And of course, the big elephant in the room is also illicit capital flows. I think almost every year, it is estimated that about at least $800 billion, leaves Africa. That money is actually enough to invest it in education, in health, and even infrastructure. But you see, we need to plug those holes, even to make sure that we don't send resources outside the continent, which we need dearly to develop the continent. Thank you.
You're certainly right, Mr. Rogers, and I agree with a lot of things you said, and it makes me remember one of the news news articles I was reading recently, and this argument about the need for debt cancellation, not even restructuring, like outright cancellation, and as you said, it's not business as usual. We're not really lending from bank institutions or financial institutions. These are national lenders. You have China, you have other players. So how do you actually approach that debt cancellation or even restructuring at the most basic? But before I go to my next question, I want to remind the listeners to kindly drop their questions in the chat box, and we'll be sure to read them out and have them answered. So my next question will be to both Amara and Dr. Masamba about this idea of debt relief or cancellation. The 2005 cancellation was, it was useful for Africa. People had to start on fresh slate. But the thing is that, as Mr. Rogers said, it seems as though people didn't learn their lessons, and we keep borrowing to unmanageable levels. So do you advocate for cancellation at this time, or some restructuring, or even if at all is restructuring, what does the ideal restructuring looks like? But I want to hear your opinion. First, Masamba, you want to go, Doctor?
Thank you. Of course, African countries have been requesting full-on debt cancellation. I don't know whether that is actually the solution to the challenges of the continent. The debt landscape is so different from what it looked like during the HIPC and the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative. Right now, we're talking about bilateral creditors like China that have said that they're not going to cancel debt. You're also talking about private sector creditors such as bondholders. And I think you're asking one of the most complex questions, because I don't think anybody has really been able to answer the question of what is the best option when it comes to restructuring, for example. It is evident that there is a need to restructure debt. And that's why, for example, we have the common framework, which offers much more broad-based restructuring than, for instance, the debt suspension initiative, the debt servicing suspension initiative that really just provided temporary relief. Now, when it comes to restructuring, I think the important note, especially from a legal perspective, is that you would have to restructure different forms of debt at different forums using different mechanisms. So at the moment, the debt restructuring landscape or the mechanisms are very fragmented. So for example, you would have maybe bilateral debt that requires maybe some Paris Club treatment, or treatment such as the DSSI and the Common Framework. But I think, to me, the biggest question, or at least the two biggest questions when it comes to restructuring, is the fact that, firstly, how do we deal with private sector debt? So the Common Framework, for example, has required countries to try to get comparable treatment as they have received in the Common Framework, which, as Dr. Rogers has mentioned, has not really moved when it comes to the 3 African countries involved. And right now, I'm even trying to wrap up an issues paper for AfroDad on the issue of how to restructure privately held debt. And it's a complexity. It's a major complexity, especially when we look at the previous experience, even in other regions, like the challenge of restructuring private debt in Argentina, for example. That was one of the biggest cases that showed the dangers of bond debt. So it's a difficult question. It's one that I think nobody has really been able to answer. There's quite a number of proposals on the table. One of those that has kind of fallen between the cracks was the idea of an international mechanism for debt restructuring. If you remember a few years ago, I think it was in 2015, if I'm not mistaken, or it may be 2014, the United Nations General Assembly had a resolution on an international framework for sovereign debt restructuring. Most developing countries felt that there was a need to have a systematic way of dealing with sovereign debt. What that framework would actually look like, I think the discussion didn't go that far. Western countries like the US felt that, the UN was not the right forum for an international framework, and was opposed to the idea, as they were opposed to the idea of a framework at the IMF. So it seems that every few decades, we go back to the same question, the same debate. There's never really an answer, it seems. I'm sure 10 years from now, we're going to be asking this exact same question: how do we restructure the debt? Because we seem to agree on the idea that there is a need to restructure. Thank you.
Fascinating, Doctor. I want to get to what you feel, Amara. I mean, it just seems as though, and I don't want to appear as though I'm faulting African governments at all. It seems as though governments know that 10, 15, 20 years, when these debt actually rise to an unmanageable level, the international lenders would not have no option other than to kind of forgive certain debt, or to kind of restructure in such a way that it now favors the African countries that are trying to service their debt. And I mean, that motivates countries to borrow more and borrow indiscriminately. But your own debt restructuring idea, or if at all you think it's necessary, what does it look like?
Thank you for the question, Ibrahim. So I'll first start off with, full-blown debt forgiveness, the extent to which that is possible. So personally, I don't think that's feasible at this time, right? Don't forget that the lenders are also, for instance, multilateral lenders, they're also lending at this time. They're lending to other countries. And so they actually need countries to pay back their loans for them to get new finance, right? To lend to other countries. For bilateral lenders, countries, countries are also facing economic crisis, and so they need this money. Private lenders, they just don't give you their money for the sake of it. They need interest to be paid back. And so I don't see the debt forgiveness, full-blown debt forgiveness, I don't see that happening now, right? Now, for the DSSI, as was mentioned earlier, and this does not mean that lenders are not doing anything. So there's the DSSI, the Debt Service Suspension Initiative, where countries were asked not to, where certain countries, eligible countries, were asked not to service their debts until the end of last year. And now there's the common framework where, lenders are actually trying to restructure debts. But a significant issue with those two initiatives is, first, the non-participation of certain creditors. So non-Paris Club creditors like China are not participating. Private creditors as well are not participating. And for a continent that owes a lot of its debts to these creditors, if some eligible countries are not even asking, they're not even asking to be part of this initiative because it does no good to them, right? Because the creditors that are participating are not significant creditors on the continent, right? And a second reason, or a second issue with these initiatives, is also the downgrade of credit ratings. So credit rating agencies, once they see that countries are asking to restructure their debts, that serves as bad signaling to these credit rating agencies, and so they downgrade countries. We've seen a number of countries being downgraded. This means that they have higher borrowing costs, and in worst case scenario, they're even locked out of the capital market. And countries don't want that, and so they keep on biting the bullets. They keep on servicing their debts, and continue to face the crisis. And so what a lot of policymakers and experts are leaning towards now is debt swaps, right? So it's a version of it happened in 2005 under the Multilateral Debt Relief Initiative, where lenders provide you debt relief savings, so they reduce the debt servicing requirement for countries, and in exchange, countries invest in agreed upon development projects, right? And so at this point, the international community, we're saying that it's important that debt is linked to development priorities, is linked to the SDGs. Any debt relief that is gotten now is linked to the SDGs, is linked to the Paris Agreement to finance climate projects and development projects. So I think that's what a lot of experts are leaning towards debt swaps, not full-blown debt forgiveness. Debt restructuring, yes, but there are issues with it. Not a lot of creditors are participating, but rather, they're leaning towards debt swaps.
Right. I mean, debt swaps in itself, it's quite an interesting debate. People are not, I mean, a lot of Africans, you see a lot of problems with it. And, state agencies, I mean, see some promises in it, but it depends on, I think, on what the priorities of each country it really is. But it's not a solution that we just neglect. It's actually a very important solution to consider as well. But before I pass the baton to my colleague Bayonle Fesobi, I would like for Dr. Rogers to kindly help us answer this question from one of our listeners. And they ask, can the African Development Bank salvage African nations from debt crisis? I mean, I know you work for the UNDP, but would you like to speak to that question, Dr. Rogers?
Yeah, I think the challenge, as colleagues, as my fellow panelists have actually, articulated it, is this issue of having a multitude of creditors. And if you look at even the amount of multilateral debt African countries, owe, it's actually less compared to the amount they owe to even the other creditors. Like China, for instance, China's debt, Africa's debt, actually is more than, it's more than the 10 creditors to the African continent. So really, this is really the challenge which we are having, that if you, and of course, with China, the way even these deals are made, and even the players there, their banks and so on. And that's also the challenge which we have. So really, I think what really the African Development Bank can help with is really how do we even develop the African capital market? Because one challenge we have is our capital markets are underdeveloped. So we can't issue debt even on our domestic market. The only country which can do that quite well is South Africa. But I think what is important is how can the African Development Bank help African countries to develop their capital markets? And I know there's quite a lot of work the African Development Bank is doing. And also, how do they help African countries in terms of, making sure that they mobilize domestic resources, capacity building in tax administration and all that? Because really, at the end of the day, we know how we can solve African development challenges. It's really, how do we mobilize resources domestically? And even from our people overseas, I know, there are a lot of countries in Africa who receive quite a lot of money from the diaspora. How do you channel those resources into investment projects, which can actually stimulate growth, going forward? And also in terms of even this issue of addressing the debt problem, I think some innovations, or in terms of even, contracting, because I think the other issue is really how do you coordinate these, creditors, the lenders? And I think this is the huge challenge. And I think in some cases, there are quite some innovations of having what is called the common action clauses, where the majority of creditors can overrule the minorities. And this can actually help in terms, because we have got a multitude of these creditors. And of course, there are quite a number of examples of successful restructuring of debt which has been done. One example is Ghana, which actually had to, do reprofiling of debt, where they had to, substitute domestic debt with foreign debt because they wanted to free up, resources for the private sector. And Benin has been quite successful in this, in reprofiling debt. And as my fellow panelists talked about of even SDG bond, I think Benin has one example which actually, in the reprofiling of its debt with the creditors, ended up issuing an SDG bond, which is actually channeled to actually, accelerate achievement of the SDG. So these are some of the initiatives which the African Development Bank, in terms of, because the technical expertise they can provide to African countries to actually address this debt crisis and even mobilize domestic resources for their development. Thank you.
Right. Well, I agree with a lot of things you said. Again, it goes back to the point of individual countries looking at what priorities they get and how restructuring, cancellation, swap works for each country. So yeah, nice point from you there. So I'll pass it now to Bayonle for his questions before I complete my own line of questioning. Bayo, you have it.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim, for passing the baton to me. Thank you so much also to our distinguished panelists for doing justice to the questions and conversation so far. Thank you so much. My questions will be a little bit interrogative because I would like to find out, opinions from our panelists as to what do you see as measures to reducing the debt in Africa? Do you see Africa reducing in their debt profile movement from now? Or in the next 5 to 10 years, do we see the debt currently owned, the debt profile of Africa rising beyond what it is at the moment? What's your perspective? Probably we take it straight from Amara. What do you think?
Well, to be honest, I don't think the debt levels will reduce anytime soon. But with regards to measures that can help countries reduce their debt levels, I would say improvements in spending efficiency. It was mentioned by Dr. Rogers earlier on. It's important that the new finance is put to good use. It's important that the new finance is used to finance investments that can, in the long term, service the debts. Another strategy to reduce debt levels is to borrow from concessional sources. So yes, you can issue Eurobonds, and yes, Eurobonds do not have conditionalities on how you can use them, but it's important to borrow from multilateral and bilateral sources that provide loans at lower interest rates and longer maturity terms. And the international community can also play a role in this. So we've seen how for countries that graduate to middle income status, we've seen how they have less access to concessional loans. So this is something that the international community can revisit. The multilateral development banks can revisit, because just because a country is now a middle income country doesn't mean that a large share of its population is not poor. So it's important for MDBs to revisit the access to concessional finance. Over.
All right, thank you. Before I request Dr. Masamba to respond, do you think loans in Africa are really even working in the first place? We get so much, credits from, some of our lenders, but it seems as though these loans are not working, and that's probably why we are unable to pay back. And that's, contributing to why we have this huge debt profile. Dr. Masamba, what do you think? Before you, of course, give your opinion on the previous question on how we can sail through.
Sure. Thank you. I think it kind of goes back to what the two panelists, my two colleagues have alluded to, which is really about what do you use debt for? What do you use borrowing for? And I believe, Dr. Rogers, you may have mentioned that a lot of the lending is used for unsustainable projects. And that is where the issue lies, I think, in my view, when it comes to why is, as you've put it, why is debt not working? It depends on what you've borrowed for, what you're using it for, and how you're using it. And just to link my response to the first question you asked, which is about African debt levels reducing, I think that African debt levels cannot and will not reduce until there is a change in attitude. And specifically, I'm thinking about the attitude in how we borrow. So when it comes to how we borrow, I do believe that there is a need for many individual countries to review their fiscal legislations that govern how they borrow, how assessments are made, whether lending passes through parliament, how much transparency there is in borrowing. Are these loan agreements available to, for instance, civil society organizations and other players that really provide checks and balances? And I'll give one small example. So for example, this week in South Africa, About 19 of the leading academics and as well as NGOs called upon the government to provide more information on how it's using its loans, including loans from the World Bank. So they wrote an open letter that I think was in the Sunday Times this week, requesting for a civil society or I can say an IFI engagement group where government could explain some of these issues. So initiatives like that promote transparency and accountability are really important. And I think you can maybe refer to the article by Professor Daniel Bradlow in The Conversation, who's discussing the need for transparency. So until we start going back to the drawing board and looking at how we borrow, transparency, accountability, and even participation, I think things will not change. And of course, I must maybe put it out there that this is only one side of the equation. With responsible borrowing, there should also be responsible lending. So there is also, I think, a role that lenders need to play, and there's an amount of responsibility that they need to carry as well. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Doctor, for your contribution. And before I invite Mr. Rogers to also weigh in into the conversation, someone, Mark just mentioned in his comments on the chat box that, you know, there seems to be a lot of, restrictions in terms of conditions into how we borrow. You know, Dr. Masamba just mentioned that, you know, whilst responsible borrowing should be encouraged, I mean, it's also important for us to also make mention of responsible lending, you know, lending that makes the borrower, fit enough to pay back. So, Dr. Rogers, what do you say? What would be your opinion as to the conditions restricting us from accessing certain loans? Given the fact that, yes, these loans are within the confines of what you describe as responsible borrowing. Dr. Rogers, Mr. Rogers, please.
Thank you for the question. I think the challenge which we have is, you know, most of this borrowing, it's not transparent as what my fellow panelists have actually, articulated. And also, although most governments in Africa have got, it's even their constitutions makes it imperative that when government borrows, this should be approved by parliament. This normally doesn't happen. The executive tends to have much more power compared to the legislature. And also it's because also the quality of people who even in the legislature, they don't even demand, the executive to be accountable. So really, to me, this is really the challenge which we have. How do we strengthen institutions so that there is accountability? And also, how do we strengthen the social contract between the citizens and the government? Because as even when we talk of revenue, the majority of the people, they feel that, even paying taxes is unfair, because if you look at the majority of the taxes which African governments mobilize, it's mainly the poor who contributes. In most countries, it's value-added tax, which is the majority of the revenue. And now the rich don't pay even, income tax and even property taxes. So really, the poor feel it's unfair for them to pay tax. So really, the issue is really how do we strengthen even the social contract between the citizens and government? And once we strengthen that, people will be willing to pay taxes because they know when they pay those taxes are the ones which are used to even provide, public services and even to make sure that you invest in development. And just to highlight what my fellow panelists talked about in the case of South Africa. If you look in the case of South Africa, just before when the budget was getting close, there was a lot of lobbying to introduce what is called, this basic income grant. And basically because the government last year made a windfall from commodity revenue. So people thought there is money there. Why can't we have a basic income grant? And people were even talking of this, what the COVID distress grant, which the government is providing for 350, why can't it be raised to, about the food poverty line? But the government said, look, we can't use the windfall which we got from commodity taxes because, looking ahead, there are risks. So it's rather we use it to retire the debt or even invest in infrastructure projects which will generate growth and even employment. So really, there's been a lot of, there were lobbying and so on, and even within the alliance itself, even COSATU said when the budget was presented, this budget is not pro, employment, is not pro-poor and so on. So really sometimes it's really how government can take those hard decisions, because it's unheard of. For instance, for the first time, South Africa had to go to the World Bank and IMF to borrow money. So really, this is the challenge which is unheard of in South Africa, for South Africa to do that, because this is one economy which can mobilize resources in its domestic market. So really, these are some of the issues which we really need to, to address going forward, that really sometimes you need to, even the government needs to actually be much more steadfast in making sure that they actually defend this, debt sustainability going forward, and even engage in debate, because I know yesterday I was even listening to the DG of Treasury, even saying, look, if I look at the budget, for instance, the interest rates I'm paying, interest payments, are more than the allocation to health and education. So now if you are talking of development, how can we leave that debt to the future generations? We need to make sure we do fiscal consolidation so that actually we retain, South Africa on a fiscal sustainability and even have a debt trajectory, which actually will enhance growth by making sure that we have a conducive business environment for the private sector to actually, invest and generate jobs. So really, these are tough choices which we need to make. And I think the issue of the social contract, the issue of making sure that we are transparent in how we spend resources, even the open budget, that people know where the resources are going, and also strengthening these institutions. I think, to me, these are key. And in some cases, it may be necessary to have fiscal rules, to make sure that, I know, for instance, Chile used to have that fiscal rule because most of their resources are generated from minerals. So the fiscal rule, which actually said, you need to make sure that you save the money for the rainy day. So you can't have a deficit beyond a certain level. So that actually you enhance, fiscal sustainability going forward. The EU used to have that, but, now because of most of the challenges, they no longer adhere to it. So really, let's look at some of these institutions which can actually strengthen accountability, enhance transparency, and even enhance the social contract between the citizens and government. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Rogers, for your contribution. And of course, it's important that we, reiterate the place of transparency, accountability, and making sure that, citizens also request for reasons why, these loans are borrowed in the first place. Probably part of why this conversation is coming up. Maybe individual countries would sit up to begin to ask questions like Mark is doing in the chat box. Why are we going to borrow this particular kind of money? To what ends? What are the justifications? What are the plans? How is this going to affect we, the citizens? And what are the measures put in place to pay back, to ensure that countries don't continue to pile up debt for their citizens? I think I'll pass the baton back now to Ibrahim to continue. Over to you.
Thanks, Bayo. Fascinating line of questioning. So I want to read out a couple of comments before I actually ask a question. So there's a comment by an anonymous attendee, and they say, my contribution is not a question, but a point to note. I think the focus is on external debts, following the tone of the discussion. However, I think that the discussion needs to cover domestic debt as well. The medium-term debt management strategy for Nigeria has pegged the ceiling for the domestic debt to 70% and 30% for external debt. This policy will further strengthen the domestic capital market. I totally agree with that. Sometimes we focus too much on external debt and not do justice to the local ones. But yeah, that's a valid comment. I think there's another comment from Arhen Dehan. And this, I think, goes to Dr. Magalie. I think they are saying, you mentioned a paper or a book that, can you reference it again? Maybe you can kindly reference it again or just drop in the chat box. But yeah, we actually have, I think, 2 or 3 proper questions. We really run out of time, but Amara, I would like for you to kindly help answer this question in a minute or a minute and 30 seconds. The question said, why are loans not working in Africa? Should we blame our leaders for channeling loans into recurrent expenses, or what's the conditionalities attached to the loans? Or is it that the conditionalities attached to the loans are what African leaders cannot meet? And I think that's a valid question as well. Amara, you want to try it?
Okay, thank you for the question. So I won't say loans are not working. I mean, I've gone on roads where loans from China have helped build. You know, the airports in Nigeria is being rehabilitated from a loan from China. So I won't say loans are not working. It's not absolute, But yes, much more has to be done with regards to the use of debts, right? And a point that was mentioned by Mr. Rogers, and which I want to reiterate, is the parliamentary scrutiny of borrowing plans, right? It's very important that lawmakers step up and actually scrutinize how much is being borrowed and what it's going to be used for. CSOs also have a role to play in this area in terms of accountability, improving accountability on how the debt is being used. Another point I want to note is institutionalizing independent debt management offices. So Nigeria has done well with this, but not enough African countries have independent debt management offices that stipulates borrowing plans, that conducts debt sustainability analysis, that are able to analyze the costs and risks associated with all the multiple sources of borrowing.
I think we lost your audio there, Amara. Maybe that's due to a connection issue. Yeah, I think we're having a connection issue from your end. Your audio, we lost your audio, but your video is perfect, so I don't know why that is. Okay, you want to try again? Oh,
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. Gotcha.
Okay, great. So I was saying institutionalizing debt management offices that have the in-house capacity to carry out debt sustainability analysis, to analyze the costs and risks associated with the loans from multiple creditors. It's very important going forward.
Right. I totally agree with that. I mean, the obvious thing, as you guys have already alluded to, is that we have deficit that needs some spending, and in many cases we often do not have ready-made cash to spend on those deficits, and in fact we have to turn to borrowing to some extent. But the thing is, we actually need to have institutions like parliaments and independent agencies that can actually verify or scrutinize those loan requests. So I totally agree with that. There's a question in the chat, but I would like to direct to Dr. Masamba, and if you could kindly answer that in a minute or a minute and 30. So the person is saying, and this is one of the questions I was going to ask, but so thank you for asking this question. So they say, also, why can't African leaders look inward and harness our resources rather than going for loans that we can't repay, facilitate development? Please shed more light on why John Magufuli, for instance, didn't agree to being a beneficiary of the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, but some other African leaders agree to it when knowing the conditions are very stringent. So it speaks to my mind. Why do we go into these loans when we know for a fact that China's intent in Africa is to make this country attached to it through loans, and also particularly when we have what that means entirely of generating revenue. So what do you say to that, Doctor?
I can't comment much on China's intentions, but what I can say is that I'll start off with my initial statement that borrowing in itself is not bad and debt is not bad. Debt that's unsustainable and mismanaged is bad. I really like the point that Amara mentioned about the fact that she's been on roads that have been financed through Chinese lending, and these roads are good. The issue is really that you do need to finance development, and there are different sources and ways of financing development. I feel that the economists on the panel are even better suited to answering or giving examples of how do you finance development. And there is a place for external debt. There is a place for domestic resource mobilization as well. And there's even a place for instance, using the private sector through public-private partnerships. If they're managed and if you select and prepare projects accordingly, then even the private sector can step in a role that the government traditionally would be playing. So I really think the question really goes back to my point about fiscal management legislations and processes. The two panelists have reiterated the role of parliamentary supervision, the issue of participation as well, and really transparency in terms of publicizing some of these agreements as well. Thank you.
Right, spot on. So we actually run out of time really fast. I would like your final point, Mr. Rojas, before I ask the other two panelists for their final statements as well. Your microphone is muted.
Yeah, so, just to reiterate what my fellow panelists have said, borrowing is not bad. It's really how you use the resources. If you use the resources to invest them in productive sectors, which actually enhance your growth and development, that's the way you should use, efficient utilization of resources. Just like revenue, the mantra these days is collect more and spend better. So I think that is what is important. And I want to raise a point which we did not address during this discussion. I think last year, actually, the IMF issued special drawing rights, and all our countries actually got their allocation as per their quota. But we have not seen any African country which has been very transparent in how they are using these SDRs. So, and I think, that's where charity begins at home. That's where you start from. You get these resources and you are paying very nominal interest rates. And why can't you open up the books to say we are going to use these SDRs in this particular sector, to enhance, development and so on. And I think, to me, it's actually one of, it's one thing which I found, which is, I think South Africa has been a bit much more transparent in how they are going to use the SDRs. But other countries have been very quiet. So we don't know how they are going to use those resources. Yet, even the IMF issued the guidelines on how those resources are going to be used. So we don't know whether our countries are going to use those guidelines. And I think this is where the role of oversight bodies, parliament, civil society is quite key to actually see how these SDRs are going to be used, whether they are going to be used to actually generate more growth, more development, or they are going to be used, invested in white elephants, which has always been the case in most of the debt which African countries have contracted.
Thank you.
Over.
Thank you. Your point, Dr. Masamba, before we pass it to Amara for a final salvo.
Yes, so I'm just going to go back and reiterate that we need a landscape that has transparency, accountability, and participation. And one of the innovations that I had mentioned is we do need to consider having forums or platforms where the community, NGOs, CSOs can actually engage and question government, in addition to all the other mechanisms like parliamentary oversight and so forth. So I'll just end on that note of accountability, transparency, and participation. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Amar, your final contribution?
So I think it's a wake-up call for African governments. Debt is rising, and we're increasingly using a lot of our revenue to service debts rather than invest in critical sectors. And so, it's a wake-up call. This is not the 90s. This is not the early 2000s where a lot of our debts is owed to Paris Club creditors who actually lead debt restructuring initiatives. It's a different time now. And so it's important that, spending efficiency is improved, is enhanced. It's important that we build credible institutions that can conduct debt sustainability analysis, that can also scrutinize borrowing plans. And lastly, it's important that we link any debt relief that we get to the SDGs and climate objectives. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much. Appreciate all the points and your time. Rogers Dhlwayo, Amara, Ekeruche, and Dr. Magalie Masamba. And also thank you to my co-panelists, Bayonle, Fesobi, and of course our other teammates just on the wall, Anna Suberu, for all she did. And of course to all the participants who tuned in and for your amazing questions. And as our panelists said, it's only when we, the people, civil society, students, every African push our governments to be more responsible with these loans that we can actually have less loan burden in the future, because frankly, loans are not going anywhere. To start a business, you need to borrow some money. So to run a country, sometimes you may need to borrow, but how do we borrow and for what do we borrow and how do we spend those borrowings are questions that we all have to push our governments on. So on that note, I want to thank you all for joining, and I'll see you next month for another edition of African Liberty Webinar. Until then, stay safe.